Joe Cerell from the Gates Foundation. Thanks for sitting with us. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely. It's great to be here. Yeah. It's always good to be at the Doha Forum.
Appreciate it. I've got a question that I've been burning to ask you about climate change at large. Why is it that so many people, generally on the right wing, hate Greta Thunberg?
Well, I think she poses a threat to the status quo, certainly. I think she embodies a lot of the outrage people feel about the inaction that a lot of policymakers have shown on this issue. She enrages a lot of the special interests who have a lot to gain by things continuing as they are. So I think it's one of the reasons why she's made people feel uncomfortable. Feeling uncomfortable is a good thing. It often means that you're sort of on the cusp of some kind of change, and we do need a change. We need a tectonic shift in how we're thinking about climate and approaching it. So I think she's been a very good and effective advocate, and I'm glad to see her voice elevated in the way it has been.
In the narrative around climate change, that was also seemed to be an issue. We spent a lot of time discussing not how to fix it and how to address it, but whether or not it actually existed. From your perspective now, working very closely on this subject, where are we from a global perspective on that narrative? Have we won in terms of science in getting people on board? We can focus on the important stuff now, or are we still trying to convince some powers that this is even a threat?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's a bad thing for the Gates Foundation if scientists and people with deep policy expertise are not listened to as much, because we're filled with a lot of geeks in the foundation. But I think with respect to climate, the overriding consensus has been established. I do think we're still going to be plagued by a few who want to question whether the science is really telling us the truth. And I think that's unfortunate. We're wasting a lot of time and a lot of precious energy. But I think you're starting to see a shift, in some cases well ahead of politicians. Companies starting to adapt the way they think and the way they invest. I think at the boardroom level there's more serious conversations. There's people in the financial sector that are much more serious about just how grave a threat this poses. And so I think those are all good signs that we can get on to the business of action and not keep debating some of the fundamental questions about whether this is something that even exists.
Absolutely. And I was reading recently about John Kerry's initiative, it's World War Zero, that he's discussed, which seems to bypass the political angle for the first time. Is that the way to go? When it's political, it's more challenging, particularly from a narrative side. It's better to go more towards, I think he was talking about developing new skills and jobs and employment in this area to help tackle it. Is that something that you would advocate?
Yeah, well, I think what this issue demonstrates is that you need to have leadership and action at all levels. And I think we have seen a crisis in a lot of national governments and their inability to confront the gravity and have policies that really support just how serious a situation we're in. So when that's the case, I think state governments have been very important. And when you think about the U.S. and how state governments in California, for instance, have really led the way on very climate progressive type of policy solutions. I think companies, again, are really starting to understand. Now, I think there's a ways to go in terms of how they really think about their carbon footprint, the impact of how they do business on the environment. But I think that the rhetoric is good and the early action is good. We just need to see at multiple levels much more leadership and action. And I think that can help, in many cases, stimulate national governments to step up.
Absolutely. And I want to kind of dive into this area that we discussed off screen here, talking about the agricultural side. Before I do, the last thing on narrative, we're here in the Middle East today, we're in the Gulf, and there's a huge youth population here. It's only getting younger as well. And a lot of drivers towards at least the push for action is coming from the youth worldwide. So just how important is this generation that's coming of age going to be in this fight?
Oh, it's critical. I mean, youth voice and youth leadership has been critical to most of the big social changes over the last century or so, and I think it's going to continue to be even more so. The youth are obviously, seeing firsthand the kind of world they're going to inherit, and even, looking ahead, the kind of world their kids are going to inherit. They're the ones who really bear the brunt of a lot of the inaction that our generation has has unfortunately led to. So I think it's really the youth that need to continue to speak up, and politicians do listen to young people in many cases, way more than people of my age. So I think really supporting them, giving them the voice, it oftentimes creates the space for a lot of the policy solutions to come in. Greta Thunberg is fantastic, because while she may be preaching something that may not be economically feasible in the next, say, 5 years, she gives space for some concrete solutions to really be put on the table.
You're working closely with those who are feeling the effects of climate change today. Can you give me a couple of examples of those areas, those industries, you mentioned small farmers, where they are feeling these effects, how the climate is changing, is having an impact on their livelihoods, and then a little bit about what your initiatives are doing to help solve those problems?
Sure. And I think when you think about climate change, it often gets boiled down into two main areas. One is climate mitigation, and that's trying to understand how the world can increasingly get to a zero carbon economy. The goal of that is by 2050, and that's a really worthwhile goal. It's going to be of the strategies we need to do to address climate, certainly the most difficult, because we need a lot of different new technologies, new ways of thinking, new ways of approaching even capitalism. And so that is an issue and a strategy that really warrants a lot of the attention. But what gets lost oftentimes in that debate is adaptation, the second part of the climate debate. And adaptation deals with how to address some of the effects of climate that we're already starting to see today. Adaptation has sometimes been taken up in a somewhat reluctant way by politicians, because in a way it seems to suggest that we failed in terms of trying to mitigate.
Yeah.
But what we need to do is recognize that we're starting to see these effects. The people that cruelly are disproportionately really bearing the brunt of climate change are the people who least contributed to it, and that's poor people living in poor countries. And of those, the overwhelming number of people really are smallholder farmers. 500 million people, or 500 million families is estimated, the number of people that are really trying to eke out a living, who can't withstand these shocks of weather patterns changing, or extended periods of drought, or long periods of flooding. So when you add that to the mix, and that's what increasingly they're starting to see more and more, it really puts a strain on their ability to grow enough food for their families, much less be able to try to sell some of those crops to have more than a subsistence living. So that's where the Gates Foundation's initiatives are really focused, how to address the needs of smallholder farmers living primarily in poor countries, sub-Saharan Africa chief amongst those.
Talk me through a couple of the initiatives slightly in depth, the technologies you're using, how you're getting in there, like the kind of, give me the meat.
Yeah, sure. Well, we have a wide range of programs. The foundation, I should say, really invested in agriculture in a big way about a decade ago, because it recognized that investing in agriculture was one of the best ways to get people out of poverty. If you're interested in poverty alleviation, agriculture is one of the best solutions. Now, agriculture has become one of the things we need to increasingly invest in as a way to try to help smallholder farmers adapt in an era of emerging climate threat. Some of the things that we're doing are investing in better seeds to really help some of those farmers adapt where they grow. So for instance, one of the promising solutions that we have invested in is rice that can withstand long periods of flooding, where when you have a situation where floods have occurred, this variety of rice can withstand a lot more of that extreme weather events, where in the previous era there wasn't that ability. We see a lot of potential in crops that don't need fertilizer in the same amounts. It's called nitrogen fixing. They can literally take nitrogen from the air and don't need the same level of fertilization, which is oftentimes one of the most expensive inputs for a farmer. So we're starting to see a lot more of new crop varieties that are going to help farmers grow in tougher conditions. And the other aspect that we're investing heavily in is data.
Yeah.
We think of poverty in terms of lack of financial resources, but it's often a farmer's lack of data in terms of knowing when to grow, what to grow, the health of soil that really is to the advantage of a lot of farmers living in the United States or across Western Europe, which we need to put into the hands of farmers as well. So we have a big program to really try to increase the degree of access that smallholders have to data to know how to be more productive on the land he or she grows on.
One of the themes that we've discussed at the show this year is the kind of the fear over a slightly declined interest in multilateral alliances, and with this kind of multipolar rise, it seems a bit confusing about who's taking the lead on what. With a move like Donald Trump withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord, these kind of things, do we need to see more of an investment from more influential people in power, people with the finances, outside of the government bodies, to really step in and take the lead on this thing?
I think at moments when you see a real collapse in multilateral thinking and a rise of nationalism, you need to try to draw in more voices into the debate and really remind people just how important collective action is to global challenges. And that's what we're facing right now in any number of areas, from global security to environmental degradation to global health. You need to have countries come together to put their national interests aside to really think about a more global perspective and, more importantly, a global plan to really fight some of the biggest threats that we face today in the world. So yes, I think there's a space for voices to remind people just how important multilateralism is today.
Absolutely. Cerell, thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Absolutely.
It's the end of a long day, a long 2 days.
Glad to be here.
Thank you so much.
Keep it up. Thanks a lot.